Hello, welcome back. Today we will be looking at the subject of violence and karma, and we're very pleased that you continue to join us in this series on understanding the intricacies of a law that governs all of our lives, entitled The Law of Karma. Sister Denise, hello and welcome.
Thank you so much. Hello.
There is a phenomena that I've discovered that spiritual definitions of words tend to be rather different from our normal definition of words. And when I look at the subject of violence, the same thing comes to mind. Violence in human terms means physically assaulting somebody, sexual violence, even emotional violence. But I know from having worked with you before that there's new depths and new meanings to words. What does violence mean in the context of spirituality?
Violence on one level is where you're harming another person and intentionally. Violence also is when you're unable to control your emotions, particularly anger, aggression, this type of thing. And there are many, many different forms of anger. So even innuendos, even implications, body language, some of the very, very subtle things that you wouldn't normally consider to be violent, but they'll still be put in that category, right? And another thing is that you know, in terms of sexuality, in spiritual terms, sexuality would be considered as a form of violence, whereas in worldly terms, only when it involves rape, assault, marital rape, or molestation, anything against a person's will. And spirituality will take it further.
Mm.
Yeah.
What is the karmic return of any act of violence on the doer of the deed and the one upon whom it is inflicted?
First of all, on the doer, it will erode their spiritual power, and they will become weakened by that. They will become more vulnerable to being out of control in that particular area. Secondly, they'll be drawing towards themselves similar violent behavior, because there is this question of karmic return. So if you do an act of violence will get done to you sooner or later, and probably a similar type of act of violence. What happens to the one on whom it is inflicted depends on that person, how they take it. So if they are terrified and they're attacked, they're much more vulnerable. If they are calm under attack, there's even the possibility that their calmness will actually cause the attack to not happen. If a person takes in the fury of it, the maliciousness of it, all of that, the more you take it in, the more it damages you. And when people study spirituality, and they learn to deflect some of this, similarly to the way a martial arts practitioner will take the energy, the negative energy that's coming towards them, and they'll deflect it, and they'll use the opponent's power to actually fell that opponent. So it's a little bit similar, but on a spiritual level, and it takes the form of circumstances rather than physical action.
The Brahmakumari advocates a vegetarian lifestyle, does it not? Why is that?
Well, there are many reasons. One is to do with the purity of the food, and non-vegetarian food these days is definitely chlorine, hormones, all kinds of chemicals are there. And then the actual process of slaughter goes into the flesh, and that goes into you. And so you're taking all that in chemically and vibrationally. And secondly, it's not actually necessary to kill animals for food in general. And so you become participant in the unnecessary killing of an animal, and so that goes onto your karmic account.
So what is a spiritual person's relationship with Mother Nature like?
If you are violating nature and grabbing what you don't need, and even when you're destroying trees unnecessarily and other parts of the plant growth, you see, all of this, you're complicit, and so the consequences are going to come on you. That means your relationship with nature is antagonistic. The air, the ocean, the earth will not be well disposed towards you if you're doing this, And if you are caring for the earth and the animals and the trees and everything, it's a very beautiful relationship, and it will take care of you. The earth, in a sense, not that it is conscious, but in many ways, it's so bountiful, and it, as if it wishes to take care of a person. But if the person is discarding the value of the earth and just using and abusing, then there's a negative relationship.
Within spiritual realm, what is the relationship supposed to be between human beings that doesn't involve any violence at all? How has God intended our relationship would be to each other? And as I ask you this question, the 7 deadly sins enumerated within the Christian faith comes to mind. I cannot remember the list offhand. I remember obvious ones like avarice and anger, but obviously there's more than that. But what is our interaction supposed to entail?
God tells us, I am your mother, father, and you are my children. So your relationship is fraternal. As souls, all are brothers. When you come into a body, it could be male or female, which means your relationship is of brother and sister. And what that means is a fraternal relationship. The law of spirituality regarding a fraternal relationship is interesting because it's the least obligation. And the obligation in a fraternal relationship is love and regard. You're not obligated any more than that or any less than that. And when you have love and regard for your fellow human being as another human brother or another human brother or sister, then the way you treat them is always with love and regard. And then whatever further relationship you may have, there are other social obligations that are added to that. But the fundamental relationship involves love and regard. So there needs to be an interaction which is mutually beneficial, an exchange, a karmic exchange which doesn't put anyone into debt, keep everything balanced, neutral. This is how it is intended.
There are unfortunately millions of individuals who learn violence at an early age. Is it possible to unlearn something as deeply inflicted upon as violence?
I think it is. I am thinking of a story of a television cameraman who during the 1970s was covering the war in Cambodia. And what he saw was so horrific that the only way he could handle it was by making himself completely, totally non-violent. And by doing that, he could actually get through without being totally traumatized. So it's a very powerful story. And it shows that there are options that people can avail themselves of, but this requires depth of perception and choice, because normally whatever is done to a person, they will then do that to others, and this is how most people operate. And in a way it goes back to the culture that we live in, which is a moralistic, patriarchal culture where morality is enforced using violence, and so people equate a certain amount of violence with goodness, and then beyond some mysterious line, which keeps changing, then it becomes bad. And that's very difficult for people to manage, you see, because, you know, if something's either good or bad, it's easier. But if a little bit is good and more than a little bit is bad, people don't know where to draw the line.
I've heard it said of people who use anger as a tool or as a means of communication. If I'm not angry at work, then I'm not taken seriously. If I don't swear at my subordinates, if I don't use vulgarities with my subordinates, then I'm not seen as a position of authority. So people use anger, for example, as a means to an end. Is this ever justifiable?
I think it's not a question of being justifiable. A person equates authority with violence because anyone in a position of authority that they've ever encountered uses violence to assert their authority. And that's a very crude way of doing things. In spiritual practice, we speak about the authority of experience. And a person who knows what they're talking about has that authority of knowledge, and who has been around the block and knows what goes. They have that authority of experience, and they will command respect because they have self-respect. I think if a person is resorting to violence in order to assert their authority in any place, it indicates this is a very weak person. Another thing that indicates that the use of violence is a sign of weakness is when people use violence when they're in a position that is much stronger than the person that they're violating, like a prison warder violating a prisoner who's chained up and doesn't have any weapons, or a person who is large and they're beating on a child or a woman, you know, who cannot fight back. You know, this is a sign of absolute weakness if somebody is doing that. And I don't think a person like that can bear the idea that their aggression indicates their weakness, but it's important that they are confronted with that. That this doesn't show that you're strong, this shows that you're weak. So people have got it wrong.
We took up the subject of sin in an earlier episode, but what is it about it that's antagonistic to the human spirit that's so bad? In other words, what's the big deal?
About violence? Well, you're damaging a person.
Yes, so in other words, what is it about violence that's such a big deal? And I'd like to know if a person's just angry, for example, but by themselves, and there's no other human being involved, is it still a sin, or is it only accumulated karma if you inflict it on another person?
I think that it's really an accumulated sin if you inflict it on another person or another creature. But a lot of times people who are angry and trying to control themselves, they'll beat the walls or they'll break something or something like that in an effort to control. Sometimes it's called a fit of anger, which means people lose control. Their emotions have greater power than their ability to restrain themselves. And in spiritual practice, it is said that it's very good if you know how to restrain yourself. But if you don't get out of control in the first place, that's a lot better.
I noticed that in another episode you used the word sanskaras. So could you take us through sanskaras of violence and how does one resolve that?
One of the interpretations of sanskaras that is used a great deal in India is that the way you experience life growing up as a child, you adopt that way yourself, you copy. And so if you've experienced a lot of violence from authority figures in your childhood, you will equate violence with authority, which corresponds to the example you mentioned a little earlier. And when a child sees that, then they will develop that mentality themselves. They will copy and they will say, well, authority, it's good to be a person of authority. That means you have to be violent. And they never really pick up that there's something wrong with it, because they see it in a context where it is respected. People who torture, they do it because torture works. And they're able to extract any information, good, bad, or correct or incorrect or whatever. But there is this quirk in human nature which really is sadistic and enjoys subjugating and making another human being miserable. And they get into a very severe karmic debt with the victim of such behavior. So that if they die and the other one dies, the chances are the roles will be reversed in a subsequent incarnation, and then it becomes a hamster wheel. And that's something people don't know. You know, whatever you do of that nature, somebody's going to do it back to you.
That is a very important aspect of karma, I think, that individuals need to understand. In my extensive reading, I remember reading something by the world-renowned author Eckhart Tolle, who says that most people fall into the category of being either a victim or an aggressor. When I read that, I thought, how does one get out of being either of those? Because neither of those categories is healthy for the human spirit.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it's quite difficult for people to be equals. And if you're equals, you're neither a victim nor an aggressor. And that kind of, you can say, democratic mentality that you are my equal, it's very special. It's really a sign of spiritual maturity. When you can recognize somebody's your equal, they may be different, but you don't put them higher than you or lower than you. Because if we're all brothers, that makes us equal. And souls don't have an age, so there's no elder brother, younger brother. We get roles, we play roles, and once it comes to the role, you play what the implications and duties of the role are, but you never forget that behind that role, you're still equals. Otherwise, people, they get fused with their role and they say, I am blah, 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 the particular role it is, and therefore you are lower than me. But this is an illusion.
There are individuals who have violence as part of their makeup, but who want to renounce that and become the opposite. What is your message to such a person who has understood deep within his spirit that this way of being is detrimental to me and also detrimental to the people I care about the most?
There are many people like that, and many like that I know personally, and I've discussed with them, and it seems that the problem is ego.
Yeah.
And the violence is a secondary manifestation of the ego. And the person with ego is a person who feels on some level inferior and needs to compensate for that by demonstrating superiority and by underlining it with violence. And that means that the person has a lot of work to do in terms of coming away from this inferiority and appreciating who they are and what they are. And they don't need to have any grandiosity. You don't need to pretend to be XYZ. It's okay to be just a basic person and be beautiful and be real and be loving and everything. But people's characters are complex, and they have a combination of flaws and beautiful characteristics, and sometimes it makes them nuts because it's difficult to reconcile these things, and therefore it's a matter of cultivating yourself, of coming into your power, becoming satisfied with who you are, recognizing your value, and not going into self-doubt or worries about how you are perceived by public opinion. You need to be, what we say, seated on your seat of self-honor and honor who it is that you are.
So ego here is the enemy.
Yeah, ego is an interesting word. You know, in the terminology that we use in Raj Yoga of Brahma Kumaris, ego is used to mean that you are flip-flopping between superiority and inferiority feelings, and you are creating masks to cover your vulnerability, and then you get fused with that mask and you say, I am the mask, and then you lose contact with yourself. It is said about ego that it compels you to trample on other people's feelings, so it makes you violent.
Okay, so a violent person always pays for his violence.
Oh yes. Anytime you do something that puts you in debt, sooner or later you have to pay. An interesting thing that you can do with the energy of violence is transform it into creative energy.
What do you mean by that?
If you want to accomplish something that requires huge amount of energy, and if you have, you know, the potential for violence, it's not that different from the potential for creativity. It just has to be channeled in a way that doesn't damage, but rather creates something very beautiful, very wonderful, very useful.
That's not something that's commonly known, what you just shared.
It's useful to know.
Thank you for that. Thank you, because I'm sure it's a question in the mind of many as to, I've got all of this anger, what on earth do I do with it? And you've now given actually quite a useful solution to it, so thank you.
Sometimes people take their anger and build a house quickly, because there's a lot of energy required for that. Put it into constructive purpose.
Well, it's very useful to know that one can get a positive outcome out of something that's potentially negative. Thank you, Sister Denise. I see we have to now say goodbye to our audience. Very interesting chat indeed about what violence is, how it impacts adversely on one's life, and what to do with your anger, with your rage, with your feelings of violence. I think the deepest message that I received today is to always know the wheel will turn against you if you're a violent person. So very powerful message, and thank you for joining us at home. I do hope to see you again soon. Take care and goodbye.